Reprise débat. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Today I rise proudly to speak in favour of Bill S-226, in short, the Sergei Magnitsky legislation. Madam Speaker, our government supports this bill, support that comes with amendments that will strengthen its implementation and its effectiveness and better align with current Canadian sanctions and immigration policy and practice. These amendments will also align with the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs recommendations that were issued on April 6, 2017. My support for this bill, Madam Speaker, comes for a few reasons that I will expand upon this evening. First, my riding of Parkdale High Park and the constituents within it. Secondly, my own background in terms of practicing constitutional and human rights law and prosecuting internationally with the UN. And third, that it resonates with the foreign policy objectives recently outlined by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Madam Speaker, turning to this first point, I want to talk about, as a prefatory comment, what Bill S-226 seeks to accomplish. It will create a legal mechanism to allow for the imposition of sanctions in response to gross violations of internationally recognized human rights, as well as acts of significant corruption. Madam Speaker, there's currently no Canadian law that authorizes the imposition of sanctions specifically for violations of international human rights, obligations in a foreign state, or for acts of corruption, including those in Russia, as highlighted in the case of Sergei Magnitsky. Bill S-226 will address this gap. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, our government also supports expanding the scope under which sanction measures can be enacted under the Special Economic Measures Act, SEMA, to include cases of gross violations of human rights and foreign corruption. So let me turn now to the category that I talked about at the outset, Madam Speaker, my constituents, the people who I'm here to represent. As the Member of Parliament for Parkdale High Park, during my tenure during the campaign 2 years ago, I've had literally hundreds of one-on-one conversations with constituents of both Polish descent and Ukrainian descent who live in my riding. The diaspora is very vibrant in my community, Madam Speaker. We are home to two preeminent festivals for both Polish Canadians and Ukrainian Canadians. And with those representatives come deep, passionate, and expressed interest in the affairs of Ukraine and of Poland. This is communicated to me regularly by stakeholders as well, such as the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, such as the Polish Canadian Congress, and individuals like Markus Kolga of the Estonian Central Council of Canada. And what they tell me is the same thing over and over again. They tell me that Eastern Europe is embattled, Madam Speaker, because of Russian aggression. They talk to me about the illegal annexation of Crimea, which our government rejects. They talk to me about the ongoing aggression and military activity in the Donbass, and the threat of ever-expansionist Russia moving across Eastern Europe. But they also talk to me about the violation of human rights for those who dare to speak out in Russia itself. It is in the effort to combat such human rights violations that this legislation was developed, Madam Speaker. By promoting respect for human rights, this legislation captures the sentiments that have been expressed to me time and time again by my Ukrainian Canadian and Polish Canadian constituents, who desire respect for basic civil liberties in Russia and want to curb Russian aggression and expansion in Eastern Europe. Madam Speaker, the second aspect that I want to discuss this evening is the category of human rights violations. I come to this chamber as a lawyer who practiced for 15 years, defending charter rights here in Canada, but also prosecuting international human rights violations abroad with the United Nations. We are lucky, Madam Speaker, in this country to have many rights and freedoms and privileges, while others around the world face real and constant danger for simply opposing their government or daring to speak out. So, Madam Speaker, I'd like to take some time to outline the specific types of international human rights violations that this bill will seek to curb or stop outright. We've heard discussion about this, Madam Speaker, but the most important component is the case of Sergei Magnitsky himself. He was a Russian lawyer. He was tortured, beaten, and killed in a Moscow prison after uncovering a $230 million tax fraud and testifying against the Russian government officials involved. Despite overwhelming evidence, Madam Speaker, incriminating these prison officials, the government of Russia exonerated everyone involved. As most people know, the people who killed Mr. Magnitsky did so for money, Madam Speaker. We know that criminals of this kind don't keep their ill-gotten gains in their country of origin. They don't keep it in places like Russia. They know all too well how easily it could be taken from them. They keep their money in the West. So, Madam Speaker, what will this legislation do to address the situation? Well, for this, I turn to none other than Bill Browder, a well-known advocate defending gross human rights violations abroad, an advocate for his own employee, Sergei Magnitsky, who died in this context. What Mr. Browder has said is that, quote, we realize that by preventing these people from storing and spending their money in the West, we could bring an end to the impunity that they enjoyed in Russia. By freezing their assets and banning their visas, we could create direct, personal consequences for human rights abusers, hitting them where it hurts the most, in their wallets. This was the genesis of Magnitsky sanctions, targeted visa bans and asset freezes imposed on individual human rights abusers. But the Sergei Magnitsky case is not the only case, Madam Speaker. That's the most troubling aspect. There's the case of Alexander Perepilchny, who suddenly dropped dead in Britain after providing key evidence in the Magnitsky case. There's the case of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who campaigned for a Canadian version of Magnitsky law and was poisoned. There's the case of Boris Nemtsov, another Russian opposition politician who campaigned in this very capital for a Canadian Magnitsky piece of legislation in 2012 and was shot dead 3 years later. And on March 21st of this very year, Madam Speaker, we had Nikolai Gorokov, a lawyer in the Magnitsky family, who fell 4 stories from his apartment in Moscow, the fall occurring the night before he was due to give new evidence in court concerning the government cover-up in the Magnitsky case. But what I want to emphasize, Madam Speaker, is that the genius of this legislation is that it is global in reach, Madam Speaker, and it needs to be, because the problem it targets is indeed global in scope. So we're talking about other nations, Madam Speaker. We're talking about examples such as Buzurgamir Yarov, a fearless human rights lawyer and whistleblower who is in Tajikistan, who was recently sentenced to 23 years of imprisonment simply for doing his job, the very type of work that I would have done here, that many people do around the planet, where he took on the cases of several leaders of the opposition in Tajikistan. Internationally, Madam Speaker, the global community has responded to these kinds of violations. The United States was the first country to adopt such sanctions in 2012 vis-a-vis Russia itself, but passing global Magnitsky legislation, expanding the reach in 2016 with the Global Act, which sanctions human rights abusers from around the planet. 44 people from around the world have been banned under that legislation from the United States. The European Parliament followed suit in 2014. Last year, Estonia passed the first Magnitsky sanctions law in Europe. And in Canada, here, a former Liberal MP, the Honourable Irwin Cotler, a man who was previously our colleague here, introduced in this chamber a Canadian version of the Magnitsky Act in 2011. So as you can see, Madam Speaker, it's important in terms of our international obligations to our partners to enact this legislation and to take action on the underlying issues it seeks to address. So let me turn there to Canada's foreign policy objectives, which were recently announced by the Minister. On June 6th, the Minister of Foreign Affairs noted, quote, that there are clear strategic threats to the liberal democratic world, including Canada, and our ability to act against such threats alone is limited. It requires cooperation with like-minded countries. Madam Speaker, when human rights violations occur around the world, that is a threat to democratic values around the world. And that is why we must implement legislation such as Bill S-226 in solidarity with other allies and members of the international community. It is only by acting in unison that we can hope to globally curb gross human rights violations and corruption. In her speech, the Minister of Foreign Affairs also noted that one of the key tenets of our foreign policy has been the basic promotion of human rights at home and abroad. She said, and I quote, "It is the Canadian John Humphrey who is generally credited as the principal author of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, the first of what was to become a series of declarations to set international standards in this vital area." Madam Speaker, I wholeheartedly concur with this sentiment. As a former war crimes prosecutor with the United Nations who tried cases on the Rwanda Genocide Tribunal, I can personally testify to the heavy involvement of Canadians at the UN and at that particular tribunal. Canadian involvement in the promotion and protection of human rights abroad is a long-standing tradition. It is a key priority for our government and for our citizens. The Minister also noted that, quote, "These institutions may seem commonplace now, Madam Speaker. We may take them for granted. We should not, because 70 years ago they were revolutionary." And finally, she made a simple but yet essential statement when she said, the Minister stated, "Our values include an unshakable commitment to pluralism, human rights, and the rule of law." That simple statement captures the essence of our democracy, and in my view, why it is only natural for us to pass this much-needed legislation. Madam Speaker, to conclude, I support this legislation because it aligns with the beliefs and convictions of my constituents, because it seeks to curb gross human rights violations from being perpetrated on individuals around the world, because it strongly aligns with our new foreign policy framework. I encourage all members of this House to support it as well. Thank you, Madam Speaker.